Hello everybody. Over the last few years I have had the privilege of getting to know a few of the old McLaren Formula 1 team, and thanks to their incredible generosity in sharing both time and knowledge, for the last 2 Christmases I have been proud to bring you a feature-length video on the golden era of Formula 1. We began with an in-depth interview with Steve Nichols, then followed that up with a close look at the championship-winning 1988 McLaren MP44, where Steve was kindly joined by chief mechanic Neil Trundle and design engineer Matthew Jeffries. Not wanting to break with what now apparently is a tradition, this year Matthew was kind enough to sit down with me and share some of his recollections of an incredible time at one of the most influential teams in Formula 1. In this piece, he talks about what it took to get into an F1 team in the 1970s, how a summer job turned into a career, and what it was like working for some of the most famous designers in history, and just how easy it can be to slip from the front to the back of the grid and then to return once more. Matthew has been absolutely vital in the creation of my previous videos, with both organisation behind the scenes and also providing many of the photographs that you see, some of which have never been shared publicly before. He asks nothing at all for his time, but if you are an F1 fan and have enjoyed today's video or my others, you should check out his range of Formula 1 themed art. His venture Car Profile Art specialises in highly accurate, hand-drawn images of famous cars, many of which he was actually partly responsible for designing. These have then been printed in high-quality, low-volume runs, and many then having special signatures attached. Currently, around a dozen different prints are available, with prices starting at £90. One particularly special print currently available is this, featuring Senna in his 1988 British Grand Prix winning MP44. What marks this out is that it's been signed by Ron Dennis, and collectors will know just how rare a Ron signature is. The prints are available for £500 each, with half of every sale being donated to Ron's Dream Chaser charity, and the first 10 viewers of this video who would like to order one will also be given a free smaller print as a thank you from us, normally available at £90. So, that's it, sit back, relax, and I'll see you again at the end.
My name is Matthew Jeffries. I was a McLaren design engineer for the Formula 1 team between 1984 and 2005. So my passion for Formula 1 started when I was in my early teens. At the British Grand Prix, which I went to at Brands Hatch in 1978, I wanted to inquire after the race, to ask somebody to see how I could get into Formula 1 as an engineer. The first team I came across was Tyrrell, and the guy there, I don't think they'd had a particularly great race, but the guy there said to me, basically, go away, I'm not interested, try somewhere else. He was a bit grumpy. And the next team along was McLaren, so there was a nice mechanic there. I think he was moving wheels around, probably Roy Reeder actually, who I got to know very well subsequently. And he said, there's a guy on the pit wall over there. He's an engineer, he's an Aussie, he'll tell you all about it. So I approached this guy who had a few beers in his hand, a few mates around, as you can imagine, and I introduced myself as a 17-year-old and said, I want to be an engineer in Formula 1, how do I go about doing that? His name was Tom Quirk, and cutting a long story short, he was so helpful, and I owe my career to him really, because he told me all sorts of things that I could do or should do, and subsequently he invited me to Colnbrook and to the team headquarters and talked to me at length about what he did and what I should do to try and become an engineer in Formula 1. As a young child, I had a passion in aircraft and military aircraft and Second World War aircraft especially, so being here at Brooklands is particularly poignant for me, but it was the man and machine and the competition element that appealed to me. It was a natural progression. It was like, how Spitfire pilots in the Battle of Britain must have felt. It was kind of the bravado and the just a Formula 1 event was very captivating. So my father was very supportive of my desire to get into Formula 1. He took me to what was to be my first race, actually, first ever race, which was the British Grand Prix in 1975, practice session. And those cars I was fascinated in because they were just so different to each other. The Hesketh 308B that James Hunt drove just won the Dutch Grand Prix, and Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni in their Ferrari 312T, with the likes of Ronnie Peterson and Jackie Ickx in their Lotus 72s and the Tyrrell 007s as well, the Scheckter and Depailler. So it was just a magical period for me as a young teenager, witnessing for the first time cars coming through Woodcut sideways, and Tom Price, of course, in the shadow was another one. Probably the first car I saw actually at speed, and it just left me breathless with admiration for these guys. So I knew I wanted to be an engineer. I had a great desire. In my family there was certainly engineering on my mother's side, and the way I approached it was to obviously I'd met Tom Quirk, and he'd helped me, and he helped me get a summer holiday job at Colnbrook in 1979 when I was 17, making tea and sweeping up. So I did that for 6 weeks during my summer holiday. Towards the end of that period, I said to my supervisor, who was the great Don Beresford, works manager at McLaren in the 70s, worked with Bruce and was very influential in the formation of the team. And I said, Don, I'd like to do an engineering degree. Do you think McLaren would sponsor me? Don was a great character. He had quite a nervous disposition, and he used to make his own roll-up cigarettes, which used to sort of stick to his bottom lips, and his eyes used to go round and round. And he sort of looked at me like this, and he said, "Oh, I doubt if we could do anything to help, but why don't you ask Teddy?" And Teddy Mayer, team, the owner of the team, he said he's outside. I plucked up the courage and I said, "Teddy, you don't know me, I've been working here." He said, "I know you." "Oh, okay." I said, "I want to be an engineer in Formula One, Teddy. Do you think McLaren could sponsor me on doing my degree course?" Because by that time I knew I wanted to do an engineering degree at Hatfield Polytechnics, now University of Hertfordshire, of course. So to my surprise, Teddy said, "Well, we've never done anything like that before, but why don't you come back in November and we'll give you an interview with Gordon Coppock, the chief designer, as it then was." So I went back in November. To my delight and surprise, they said, "Well, we've not done this before, but we're willing to give it a go. We can't pay for any of your course fees, but we'll give you your industrial training periods," because it was what was known as a thin sandwich degree. So I had a number of months throughout the 4 years that I was spent in industry. I'm a great believer in fate meeting you halfway with something, because when I thought about it, there was no way that Teddy and Gordon Coppock were going to come to my family home, knock on the door and offer me a job. So in 1979, when I was doing my holiday job, sweeping up and making tea, it was coming to the end of the McLaren racing era, the McLaren that Bruce had started in 1963. Obviously Teddy and Gordon Coppock were struggling with the cars, and perhaps hadn't quite grasped quickly enough the ground effect concept that Lotus had introduced in 1978. So in 1980, Ron, through his connections with John Hogan at Marlboro, had suggested that he, with John Barnard, who had joined him, or he had managed to get as a chief designer for himself, became a Formula One team with Marlboro sponsorship. John Hogan politely told Ron, I think, that, well, they had too much money, too much interest invested in McLaren racing, but suggested that perhaps what they should do was amalgamate Ron's Project 4 team, which was in Formula 2, Formula 3 at the time, with McLaren Racing. So in September 1980, I think it was, McLaren International was born, with Ron Dennis and Teddy Mayer being joint managing directors, and John Barnard became the chief designer. Unfortunately, Gordon Coppock at that stage didn't have a place, so his era had come to an end. I regretted very much that Gordon was leaving. I didn't know John Barnard, what John Barnard would be like. Slightly nervous times for me, because I was thinking, you know, would they still be supportive of me doing my engineering degree at Hatfield? Very lucky. I was delighted that John Barnard was very supportive of a engineering student or having me on board as a student, because he felt this was somebody that he could mould in a way that he wanted me to develop, which was always a sort of concern of his, that he wanted to train people like he thought. And really, you know, when Ron and John joined McLaren, everybody was just amazed at the new levels of attention to detail and that they brought with them. They were both the same in that regard. Everything had to be done perfectly. A lot of people from the old McLaren racing team struggled with that a bit, I think. It was an era where mechanics had sometimes designed bits themselves. You know, some bits didn't come from the drawing office. They were crafted and created on the mechanics' workbench at the factory, which John put a stop to immediately and said, no, everything has to come from me and the design team. So working for John Barnard as a student, initially during my industrial training periods, it was a baptism of fire for me, because I had never come across somebody who was so terrifying in a way as a boss. I hadn't had a real boss, of course, but anybody I'd met previously didn't have the same kind of wrath that John could bring to bear. And he could literally, if something wasn't right or something upset him, he could literally turn purple with rage at something. And occasionally, you know, we'd be sitting at our drawing boards and the drawing office door would fly open and John would burst in, having been down in the workshop, and something wasn't right. And we'd be on our drawing boards thinking, oh, not me, please, not me, kind of thing. And if he swept past, he thought, oh, thank God for that, you know, it's not me. But occasionally it was me. The strange thing about John is that what really mattered to him was the fact that something had gone on. He wasn't a vindictive person. He wasn't, you know, it wasn't personal. He was just very upset that something wasn't right. And you had to get to know that, you had to appreciate that, because 5 minutes later he'd come back and he'd be talking to you in quite a normal voice about, you know, what should we do here, how do we solve this one, what do you think of this, or, you know, and he was asking me what I thought, you know. So it was quite bizarre in a way that 5 minutes after this rage he could be just completely normal again. And I remember Pete Burns, who was an amazing fabricator, head of the fabrication shop, saying to me, because I'd been down to him and said, I've upset John and something's gone wrong. And he said, and he put his arm around my shoulder and he said, don't worry, Matthew, he likes you. I said, he likes me? How can you say that? He said, no, look, you've still got a job, haven't you? He likes you. So he's just upset that it's gone wrong. The drawing office in 1983, a design office, drawing office, consisted of about 6 people, I guess, and there were some great people. Steve Nichols and Alan Jenkins were being coached as race engineers, but they were very much involved with the design. Steve very much in terms of the structural design of components. Alan Jenkins with the bodywork. But I learned so much as well from the likes of a couple of draftsmen that we had, Mike Locke and Colin Smith, who helped me enormously in developing my career and teaching me the do's and don'ts of designing cars. But I remember they told me, just remember rule 1 and rule 2, which was rule 1 is John Barnard is always right, and rule 2 is when John Barnard is wrong, refer to rule 1. John was very much a dictator in terms of what he wanted, but he was very, very clever. Looking back on it now, John was an exceptional engineer and a very innovative engineer, and he introduced or thought of using carbon fibre for the monocoque design. He subsequently invented the semi-automatic transmission at Ferrari. He was always thinking of new, innovative things. And I think for him, the passion was the engineering, and whether it was racing cars or whether it was something else, it was kind of the inventive process of creating something and doing something exceptionally well. Later on, when Steve was appointed chief designer, he was a very different chief designer, very much wanted to involve the brains of everybody, although he was very much the sort of the conductor of the orchestra, if you like, and he wanted to get the best possible solution through using the team of people that he had under him. But with John, it was very much a kind of he wanted his stamp on everything. He had an amazing ability as well to spot something on your drawing board from about 10 paces that wasn't right. And he would, it was like he did a sort of double take, and he would come straight at you, sort of saying, that's not what I said to do. He could be like he was, I think, and, because he was right probably 80 to 90% of the time, if you like. Later on, I encountered people trying to behave like that who basically came across as being like bullies, basically, because they tried to emulate that kind of behavior. But very often they were right less than 50% of the time, and you can't get away with it if you're not clever. So John was very, very clever, still is, very clever like that. Another lesson I learnt when I joined McLaren and in the drawing office was everybody worked well as a team of people, obviously, getting involved with lots of different aspects of the car. It was a great training ground for young engineers because you could be involved with virtually anything on the car, and you get a good general knowledge and understanding of all aspects of the car design. Something which I think is lost on, not necessarily lost, but not perhaps given enough attention to in modern times, because cars are so complex and teams are so big now. It's very difficult for a young engineer to get a good grounding in lots of different areas of car design. You come in as a specialist and you can spend your whole life, being a specialist in cooling system design, and you'd never get to see another part of the car unless you actually deliberately moved around by the management. Of course, it's not necessarily in the team's interest to move people around because they want people to do the best possible job on a car program which is very tight for time, so you don't move people around unnecessarily like that. The danger of doing that is that you create a team of specialists, and you don't create the future sort of technical directors or good technical directors or chief designers for the future, because you're not giving them enough of the different areas of the car to get experience of. I think it was Martin Whitmarsh actually, he said it's good to have a T to your career, so you get to experience lots of things in a generalist way, and then perhaps have one specialist subject where you drill down and you become very clever at one particular bit, maybe more than one. But so I always thought that was quite an interesting concept, and something which perhaps isn't followed so much these days. So when I graduated in 1984, August 1984, I think I was the number 7 in the design office. And I developed an understanding of a close working team that really worked well together. And when I thought about it, a few years later, after we had expanded enormously, there was something about a team under 10, certainly under 12. We used to go to the pub on a Friday lunchtime, sit around a table. Everybody knew what everybody was working on. We could bounce ideas off each other if we had problems, and it was a close working team, very productive, self-managing. When we got bigger than 12, it kind of organically subdivided into 2 groups. One group still went to the pub, but another group decided, well, no, we don't want to do that. So managing those sub-teams, if you like, became more and more difficult. It's something which you note in other industries and perhaps other professions as well. You notice that sports teams are around about 10 or 12, fighter squadrons are about 12 or whatever, and it seems like there's an optimum group of people that can be managed to get the best kind of results. When I left McLaren, for example, I think there are about 120 people in the design office, essentially doing the same job that when I started 20 odd years previously. There were 7 of us at the time, but of course the depth and the granularity of the tasks just sort of increased, so that you had a whole team of people doing what perhaps I would have done, as a 3-week project or something. You've got a whole department doing it now. But so that's just, I guess, the nature of engineering in terms of things becoming more and more technical and trying to get the nth degree out of trying to solve problems and to make the cars go faster. So in 1983, I was still doing my industrial placement. McLaren were introducing refuelling for the first time. I think Brabham had introduced it, and it was something which was going to be a way forward for optimizing the race strategy. So we developed our version, which was incredibly dangerous looking back on it. In fact, I remember we made a cylindrical pressure vessel, which we filled with fuel and compressed air. And when I spoke to the guy at BOC about what we were doing, he said, "You do realise you're making a potentially lethal weapon there?" I said, "Well, yes, but that's kind of what we decided is going to happen." Anyway, so we built these pressure vessels, and we used aircraft spec refueling hoses and adapters that plugged onto the side of the chassis, which became ubiquitous subsequently. But also it required a vent side as well, of course. And the idea was a mechanic with the fuel would plug onto one side, but only after the guy on the other side had put his venting tube on, or connector on. And we had prepared this for the first time, and it was ready to be tested just before lunch one day. And John Barnard, who often went home for lunch, said, "Right, after lunch, we'll give it a go." Anyway, I can't mention names, but it was decided by somebody over the lunchtime period that they would give it a go. They thought perhaps time was of the essence. Anyway, the guy with the vent valve or tube plugged on a bit late. So you can imagine with this pressurized fuel going into a tank with no vent, of course what happens is it blew up the back of the monocoque in the fuel cell area, completely destroyed it. And I can always remember when John came back, there was everybody was scurrying around trying to sort of think of what to do and what to say. And Ron had the job of telling John what had happened. John came in and he went through to I could hear his own drawing office door open, and then Ron sort of swooshing in behind him. And I think Steve was behind Ron as well. And I can just remember the door slamming, but I could hear through the wall Ron saying, "John, don't OD, but," and he didn't have to say anything other than, or get any further than "but." And John said, "You've blown up the bloody car, haven't you?" And he just knew it instinctively what they'd done, what had happened. But he was so unimpressed with that situation. So I mentioned that John was a very innovative engineer, and of course he's credited for bringing or making the first carbon fibre monocoque. Lotus claim that they pipped him with their design, but of course they did it slightly differently, and they moulded panels which they folded up to subsequently to join. John's design involved making a one-piece main shell structure, made on aluminium tooling on the inside of the monocoque, which then had to be designed in such a way that it, after curing, it could all be extracted through the cockpit opening area of the cars. So John had invented this way of doing it together with Arthur Webb, who worked at the RAE at the time, became a good friend of John's and very helpful in terms of, he was one of the sort of composite experts, if you like. Steve had suggested that Ron and John go to Hercules, where he'd previously worked, and persuaded them to get involved in terms of supplying material, but also manufacturing the first monocoques. So the first monocoques, the first carbon fibre monocoque was the MP41, which was introduced in 1981, of course. And by 1983, when it was evident that we were going to need a turbo engine, and Ron, together with Mansur Auger, had managed to persuade Porsche to design and build what became the TAG V6 turbo engine. And John was heavily involved with the architecture of that engine in terms of putting ancillaries on the front and keeping the V very clean, and the position of the turbos and everything, basically designing it around a ground effect car. And I can remember him being absolutely gutted when the FIA decided for 83 flat bottom cars, which completely negated all the advantages that he'd built or had built into the TAG turbo engine. So after Silverstone, 1983, it became evident that we were going to have to hurry up with our TAG turbo engine car, and Colin Smith was heavily involved in doing a mule car, which was converting an MP41 chassis to accept the first TAG turbo engine. That became known as the 1D. And very quickly after that, we were presented with having to do what became the MP41E, which was a raceable version. And that came about because of pressure from Niki Lauda, who insisted we needed to start racing the TAG turbo, which was still being developed in 83, of course, as soon as possible. So John didn't want to do this. John Barnard didn't want to do this and was very reluctant. It lacked rear end downforce because we didn't have big enough wings and things, but and the engine had a few hiccups and things, but it was probably the right thing. Well, it was the right thing to do, because by the beginning of 1984, when the definitive 84 car was designed, the MP42, the engine was really developed to a stage whereby it was a race winner from the beginning. After I graduated in 1984, I joined full-time in the design office, and one of the first jobs that John Barnard gave me was to look at the new crash test regulations which were coming in for 1985, especially mainly the nosebox structure, which had to comply with new regulations and undergo a physical test as well. To do that, we needed to, I think from memory, the regulation was the car had to be travelling at 30 miles an hour, and the nosebox had to absorb all the energy within a certain length. The average deceleration mustn't be more than 25, deceleration must be more than 25 G, and it mustn't peak at more than 90, something like that. And of course we had no idea at that stage in 1984 how our current design would perform. So John asked me, as one of my first jobs, was to design a drop tower which we built outside the back of the factory. It's 10 meters high and had to hoist 750 kilos of mass with the nosebox hanging underneath it, and then it was released and dropped so that it was doing 30 miles an hour as it hit. You come out of doing your degree and you think, oh, I'm an engineer now, and then you start in full-time employment and you just realise you know nothing. You know, everybody just knows so much more than you do, and you just think, crikey. As well as designing the drop tower, I had to design the release mechanism by which we had to control the release, hoist safely this thing up and then release it. So I had designed this sort of scissor arrangement hook which crossed over, and then there was a component at the top which held the two hooks together in a scissor way, and it was pneumatically controlled. So it actually just blew the top off of this thing when you pressed an air gun, an airline was connected to it, and when the top blew off, the hook opened and the mass fell, and I was pleased because it worked a treat. What was less pleasing was that we thought we would try to see where we were with the existing nose box that we had, which was just an aluminium structure, probably about this long. So when we dropped it, it flattened to within less than an inch, this thing. And all the energy went into the concrete block that we had the drop tower was built around, and it cracked the concrete block, so we had to completely redesign the drop tower. My main role developed more in 1985 when John had come up with a MP4 2B. One of the regulation changes that year was to ban what were known as the winglets. So if you look at the 84 car, for example, either side of the main rear wing, that we had winglets, which were mini wings, which were incredibly efficient, incredible downforce for minimal extra drag. And with the turbo car, when it was first introduced in 1E form, it lacked so much rear downforce that having these winglets on the rear wing in 84 on the MP4 2 was made it so effective aerodynamically. And of course we'd lost that in 1985 because they were banned. So the 85 car really struggled, I think, with rear end grip. And one of the things John, who had, I think, anticipated that, did was to completely redesign the rear suspension. So one of the main changes between a 2 and a 2B is around the rear end. Subsequently, I think, again from memory, the 86 car that John introduced was another evolution of the 2B, but the side pods were a bit shorter, and I think he was trying to shift the centre of pressure back again to make up for lost rear end downforce. And again, another major redesign of the rear suspension. In fact, I remember one test that they did a new rear suspension, and it suffered from bump steer. And I can remember Nicky saying that after having driven it for probably just one lap around Silverstone, he said, "You don't need me, the car steers itself." But by that time, I think John was, it's difficult to say, but from our point of view, he seemed not less interested, but he certainly seemed more wrapped up in the political goings on with Ron, and he obviously had ambitions to move on. We couldn't think that was possible because very sort of strong family man. We didn't think he was going to head off to Italy and do it, because there was these rumours about Ferrari and things. But little did we know, of course, that Enzo Ferrari had actually allowed him to set up his own technical office in such as south of Guildford, so he didn't have to move to Italy. So between 84 and 86, I was still very much a junior engineer, the young engineer in the design office, and got to work on a number of components, of course, a wide variety of components. And I'm very grateful to John for allowing me to have that experience. I was certainly taking an interest in the composite side of things, and I could see my career developing on the structural side of things and the installation of all the components that surround the monocoque, which is pretty well everything apart from the rear wing and the gearbox. So lots of interesting projects, but we were all caught out when JB did not announce, but it became evident that he was off to Ferrari. And it was, a lot of us were incredulous that that was happening. We just didn't foresee that happening at all. I don't think Ron did either. Not panic, but there was a lot of concern. Obviously, what were we going to do if, Barnard, who had been, as I mentioned, the sort of creator of everything and the number one designer through whom everybody, did everything, what we were going to do without him. And I remember the whole design office was interviewed on a one-to-one basis by Crichton Brown, who was Ron's number two, asking for our opinions of what we should do. And I think to a man, everybody said, well, we'll just carry on. Steve's a talented engineer and he's got good design ideas. We'll carry on without John and see how we get on. When of course Ron couldn't take the risk of an unknown, because in those days I think you had to have some kind of established figurehead at the design helm to really attract the sponsors, keep the sponsors happy. So I think he felt under a lot of pressure to get a name designer in. He'd strengthened the team. He'd hired Neil Oatley from Force, and unbeknown to us, he had asked Gordon Murray to join. So John left in August, I think, 86. He hadn't done anything about a car for 87. So Steve was appointed chief designer for 87 and subsequently all turbo cars. But the way in which Gordon was introduced was quite unusual. We had, not totally unexpected, but the pleasant experience of Prost having won in Adelaide, won the championship at Adelaide, with the famous Mansell tyre blowout and Ron and Alain needing to win the race, which he did, and subsequently won the championship. So that was just an unbelievable celebration, if you can imagine. I can remember being down at my parents' house in Bath at that time and at the weekend, and raced back, well, not raced, but drove back as safely as I could to Woking to take part in the celebrations on the Monday morning, because it was, well, it was just a fantastic feeling to have won that championship. Soon after that, Ron said to the design office, right, I'm going to take you all out to dinner. And we went to a nice restaurant in Ripley, the Toby Cottage, I think it was. And we thought it was just to celebrate Alain's championship win. And then quite early on, Ron stood up and said, oh, just want to introduce you to somebody. And it was bizarre because we were sitting around this big dinner table, and Gordon appeared from what appeared to be, looked like a broom cupboard to us. It's like he stepped out of a broom cupboard in a sort of Basil Fawlty looking for game pie on the ceiling way. And Ron said, well, Gordon has agreed to join us as technical director. And we didn't see that coming at all, because we thought, well, why? Why do we need Gordon, kind of thing? But Ron had his reasons, and Gordon joined. Interestingly, though, both Ron and Gordon stressed that he wasn't coming to be chief designer or design the cars, he was very respectful of the setup that we had, And you know, I think he's been quoted as saying what amazed him was that McLaren at that time had a number of people who, you know, with Steve, with Neil Oatley, and I think Gordon Kimball was still with us at that stage as well. Any one of these people could have been promoted to be chief designer. So he was very keen not to want to upset the status quo that McLaren had, the stability that McLaren had. And his role was to be one of new operational procedures and production efficiencies and things. So he wanted to get involved in the running of the company and improving the technical performance of the company. Subsequently, confirmed everybody's roles, including his, in doing that in a memo which he distributed to everybody, all the senior management in the company. So that was our introduction to Gordon. By 1987, with Steve having little time, sort of late 86, beginning of 87, to design what became the MP4-3, he basically took the approach of doing what he could. I mean, his approach is always one of, you know, you do all you can with the bits that you're presented with the regulations that you're presented with, and in the time available. So there were a number of things that he chose to do, one of which was to try and further lower the centre of gravity of the car from previous Barnard cars. So the three had a different fuel cell shape, try and get the fuel a bit lower. It had side exit radiators, lower side pods, all with a view to lowering the centre of gravity of the car. We couldn't do much about, well, there wasn't time to do much different with the front suspension or the wings, but overall the MP4-3 was quite a nice looking car, and it was quite a low car as well. You know, obviously with a racing car you want it to be as low as possible. It was let down a little bit with, well, quite a lot actually, with alternator and reliability problems, which subsequently were fixed. But it did well enough, as Steve has often said, it did well enough to attract Honda and Senna to the team. So during the course of 1987, we were aware of the regulation changes, of course, that were coming for 88 and the final year of turbo cars. We didn't know what engine we were going to have. We knew Steve was chief designer. We knew that as time went on, we were faced with less and less, you know, time to crack on with the car that we were going to be racing. And by August 87, it was apparent that we were going to be going with Honda, and that Ayrton was going to be joining us from Lotus, which, you know, to his credit, Prost had said, you know, you need to get Ayrton, he's the best, and the team needs the best two drivers. And he wasn't worried about Senna coming. He thought that the obvious thing to do for Ron would be to get Ayrton on board, and of course that whole package with Honda was the stars aligning, if you like. But we, as a design team, realised as well that, you know, with the two best drivers in Formula One at the time, and with Honda with, you know, the best engine at the time, the pressure was on us to deliver something pretty special as well. So my role in late '87 was first of all was to be quite heavily involved with the design of the mule car, which was the MP4-3B, which was the Honda engine with a higher crank that Williams had been running, fitted to a modified MP43 just to get the relationship going and understanding of Honda, how they worked, and we knew that car wasn't going to be the one we were going to be racing, but it was obviously a learning curve and a development car for us. So that was a project that we had to crack on with in late 80, or the autumn of 87. We also knew, obviously, as I mentioned, that a decision had been made that despite the regulations being opened for either turbos or normally aspirated cars for 88, Honda had done their sums and come to the conclusion, even with the boost restrictions and the fuel being limited, the turbo engine still edged it, or potentially should edge it, in terms of the way to go for 88. So the decision was made to design the 88 car around their new turbo, V6 turbo, which was being designed by the great engine designer Michio Kawamoto, who had typical Honda to extract every amount of possible performance from the engine. They had redesigned their engine around a lower crank because of the smaller clutch that was available. So it further reduced the centre of gravity of the engine. So a completely new engine, different to the one that we'd been putting in the MP43B, different to the Williams one, was designed for us just for 1 year, for 1988, which was an incredible thing to do, but obviously the right thing to do. So my responsibility was for the monocoque and front suspension. Dave North was responsible for the gearbox design, and latterly we had David Nielsen come from Arrows, and he, I think November, was put in charge of the rear suspension design. But we had other great young engineers like Hugh Moran, who were heavily involved with some of the detailed design of the composite parts, the monocoque drop-in bathtub piece and the turbo inlets, for example. So we had our work cut out. Everybody, it was a great team of people. I don't think we really appreciated it at the time, because none of us were, cream of the cream engineers. We were, we like to think we were pretty competent engineers, but we all fitted together in a way that just made a fantastic team of people. It's interesting because engineering is such a vast field, and there are different styles and different ways of approaching problems, different personality types. Some are sort of more creative and some are more sort of detailed people. Some like the stress and the number crunching. Some people like just the creative blue sky thinking. On one hand, we'd experienced Barnard with his very meticulous eye for detail and innovation. Steve was completely different to that. He liked to design a little bit on his own board, but Steve's a great thinker. And I think that's what's lost on a lot of people, is because it's difficult to convey how well somebody's doing their job if they're spending a lot of time looking as though they're just thinking and you don't know what they're thinking about. But Steve has an amazing ability to boil everything down to logic. He likes to work through other people in doing that, and that suited me a lot. I benefited from that because I was allowed to do quite a lot of creative stuff in the design of the front suspension, the installation of the front suspension, and yeah, it was a great time to be working in Formula One, to have that kind of free hand and responsibility as well. I got to meet, all the drivers and to make sure that they were happy in terms of their fit into the monocoque, and got to know them on a sort of personal level as well, which was quite looking back such a privilege. At the time it was just part of the job, but the likes of Prost and Senna and not so much Lauda. I didn't really get involved with Lauda, but those guys, they just had something different about them. And certainly with both Prost and Senna, when we first sat them in the mock-up, they were so in tune with every small detail, the position of the wheel, the reach to the gear lever, the pedal positions. Everything was fractions of millimeters sometimes in terms of how they wanted something, because they were just so focused on what it would be like to actually be driving the car. This was long before they actually drove the car, of course. And making their seats, they would be, the way we make the seats is to put a two-part foam in behind a flexible rubber sheeting and drop it into the mock-up of the car. And they would get comfortable and mold the seat and then cut the foam out to actually fit in. And invariably, it wouldn't be right for the first one. So by the time the first test came along, there'd be a modification come back from the first time that they drove, and then they'd want to do another seat, so they'd come back to the factory and do another seat. And probably by the first race, they'd have done about 2 or 3 different seats, just because of the attention to detail in terms of how they wanted to be positioned in the car. So it was fascinating. People asked me about what was it like to work with Senna, and not an easy character. He was so focused on everything to be as he wanted it, and he didn't have much time. He didn't take joking around, or he didn't take fools gladly. So there was an intensity about him. Although he could be humorous when he wanted to be, quite a difficult character a lot of the time, I found. But equally, a bit of a contradiction, because he could equally be friendly and very open as well. I remember late one evening, January '88, when we were up to our eyes in designing, and I think it was Steve was in his office. It was 8 o'clock at night, and I was there, and maybe 1 or 2 others. Found ourselves in the company of Ayrton. Ayrton had arrived. I think that was the first time he was probably allowed to come to McLaren, and he'd come in late in the evening just to have a look around and to talk to people. And he was absolutely charming, and he walked around, asked what we were doing. We talked about Lotus, and he wanted to know about what we were doing for the '88 car. And I've always regretted it since, of course, but he said to me, "So what time do you guys eat?" I said, "Well, we've got a bit more to do. We might go and have a McDonald's or something." But he said, "Well, do you want to come and we'll go out for lunch? Go out for dinner now?" I said, "Well, I think I'd better get on, actually. Yeah. No, thanks very much." And I've always regretted that. I didn't take him up on that. But another time, it was after the British Grand Prix in '88, soaking race, torrential rain, dreadful conditions. And he came to the office again after that race, one day after that race, and I said to him, "How do you do it? How do you drive in those conditions where literally you're driving at nearly 200 miles an hour down the Hanger Straight, and you don't know, there's just a ball of spray in front of you, and you don't know if somebody's spun or..." He said, "Well, I just look at the side of the track, the white lines. I'm just looking sideways the whole time, just, confident that nobody is in front of me that I'm going to hit." And he just sort of operated like that. And I said to him, "But are you not worried about hurting yourself? Or most normal people would be cautious at least." He said, "Being a Formula One driver, you just have to accept that you can hurt yourself." And I always wish I could remember exactly the words he used and what he said, but it was to the tune of, "Well, I'm okay with it. It can happen, but I'm okay with it." So with Alain, he was completely different. Super friendly, good sense of humour, but at the same time, he had the same meticulous attention to detail for everything to be as he wanted it. In '89, because I was a design engineer based at the factory, I wasn't part of the race team, so I didn't go to the races. But as part of a sort of development program for engineers, they took me along to Monza and to a test at Monza a week or so before the Grand Prix. I was instructed that in the morning I would be helping Prost as the engineer in charge, should we say. And then at lunchtime I'd swap over and be the same for Ayrton. I remember at lunchtime, I think it was Indy Lal, who ran the test team, coming up to me and saying, wonder if you could, do you mind staying with Alain this afternoon? It's just that Ayrton's not too keen on these sort of student training schemes type things, so you know, he'd be happier if you stayed with Alain. So I said okay. So I went back to Alain and said, Alain, it appears that you've got me again this afternoon. Sorry about that. It seems Ayrton doesn't want me. And he said, don't worry, Matthew. I don't think he wants me much either. So, that was his response.
Matthew wishes to pay a particular thank you to Tim Wright for being a guiding light on this event and for his help throughout his career.
So once the season starts, the rest of us who are office-based, we're not just twiddling our thumbs, of course. There's a whole program of work, job lists created, especially the Imola test preceding the start of the '88 season. The car was exceptionally good, but it still generated a whole load of work. And of course, there's a program of development ideas which Steve wanted to start thinking about, or because you can never stay still, of course. So you're always looking to improve, even if the car's good. You'd say, where do we go from here? What else could we do? So you know, Steve never quite liked the original snorkels, and even though it was the turbo inlets, and that was quite a big package of work. And don't forget, there's still relatively few people. And of course, after each race, something would happen, or something would be required to be changed. I mentioned with the drivers, you know, they're very particular with their controls and their surroundings. And sometimes it would just be a very small modification to the shape of the throttle pedal, something that one of them wanted, or shave a little bit off the clutch rest, which was also, you know, positional-wise critical for them. So they were super sensitive to all these kind of things, and it was, you know, it was another item on the jobs list.
Despite having just designed their most successful car, Steve Nichols was unable to negotiate terms with Ron Dennis and so departed the team at the end of 1989 to eventually follow Alain Prost into Ferrari. This left McLaren with just the one chief designer yet again, in the form of Neil Oatley, who had already been working alongside the team getting ready for the new rules following the '88 season. His first design was the test mule, the MP44B.
A very good car. In fact, Emanuele Pirro, who was our test driver at the time, said that they should be trying to race that car in 1989 because it was just so good. Unfortunately, it didn't have a fuel tank big enough to be a race car, so it was only ever going to be a development car. And so Neil, who was working on that whilst we were working on the turbo car in '88, he was working on that effectively on his own until mid-season, and then many more of us. You mentioned what do we do when the cars start racing, but more of us would go on to his project. So we were working with Neil more directly than we were with Steve. Partway through that year, of course, we then started the design of the MP45, which was to be the '89 race car. Working with Neil as chief designer, Neil's brilliant engineer, more akin to Barnard, but not like Steve at all. Neil is what we call a completer finisher. For those of you who might be familiar with Meredith Belbin, he identified different types of person that you wanted on board a team to make the team the most effective. They've got funny names like plants and completer finishers, and they've all got different attributes which make them particularly complementary, if you like, when they're put together with others of differing types. And Neil is very much a completer finisher. He dots the I's, crosses the T's. He knows every nut and bolt on the car. Still does, I think, probably. And his attention to detail is just, astounding. It wasn't a weakness as such, but Neil's style is for the creative stuff, would be to use others or to come up with ideas which he either agreed with or didn't. But working with Neil was very enjoyable. You could take ideas to him. He really thought them through. So he wouldn't come up necessarily with an instant answer for you, but he would give it a level of thought which normally resulted in something which was going to be right from the point of view of he's looked at it from every angle and he's come to a conclusion, and normally he's pretty good at what the conclusion he comes to. So I think one of the most enjoyable but stressful things about Formula One is it's like I imagine wartime to be, because it's a competition and there are immovable targets. You have to design a car, it has to be ready for the first race, and roughly speaking, every fortnight there's a race on and you can't afford to miss it. So that in itself presents untold stresses on getting things done, on what you decide you can achieve in a certain time, and it just has to be done, it has to be ready. So looking back on it, you think, oh yeah, it was a great period of my life, which it was, but the stress of working long hours and devoting your life to and worrying about things which things which had to be done and had to be ready, and it was just relentless. If you stand still, you'll history. So great times, but very stressful times. So under Neil, we had designed the MP4 5, which was a pretty successful car in its own right. For some strange reason, which we never quite got to the bottom of, I think, it didn't match the 4B in many aspects, and there's still a lot of debate as to the subtle differences between the two and why that was. But the 5 was still a car which was very successful, obviously, and Prost and Senna drove it to great effect, resulting in their coming together at Suzuka, of course, but and ultimately Prost winning the championship that year. With a successful car like that, we were in discussions with Honda about what they should do next. And they had proposed a V12, which they felt would give more power. Obviously there are some negatives associated with that, and the engine's bigger and heavier and it uses more fuel, but on balance with their calculations, they felt that they could get more power from a V12, so that should be the future. However, that wasn't going to be ready for the start of 1990 season, so we did what was the MP4 5B, which was a revised version of the 5 with different aerodynamic changes and things, but which, again, a very successful car. Ayrton won the championship in it, of course. My role in 1990, I was project leader for the what was to be known as the 5C, which was the first V12 engine in a modified 5B chassis. We also cracked on with the definitive 1991 race car, which was the MP4 6. That needed bigger fuel tank. The car was a little bit longer because of a longer engine. It was heavier, so we had to reduce the weight of the car to the minimum. But when it first ran, we got the impression straight away, both Berger and Senna thought that power's not as great as they wanted it to be, and they had reservations about how good the car was going to be. Fortunately, I think the opposition didn't start the year as Williams didn't, with their 14, wasn't dialed in, shall we say, as much as it later became. And I think Ayrton won the first 4 races in '91 with the V12 powered car. Again, an engine designed by Michio Kawamoto, who did a fantastic job, and I was very fortunate to work closely with him on the engine installation for that. went through a couple of upgrades. Honda were fantastic at just pouring resources into doing the best that they could in the shortest possible time. So by mid-season, I think we were up to the third version. I think there was one at Imola and another one came in perhaps like Mexico. So Mexico, for example, with its unique altitude and performance problems, they would produce an engine especially for that race. A great example of the sort of levels that they went to, or the depths that they went to actually to achieve the best they could possibly do. The 6 probably wasn't our greatest car, but it was pretty good. And I think that even though Ayrton felt that we probably should have stuck with the V10 engine, he went on to win the championship in '91 in the 6. And I think I'm right in saying that's the one and only World Championship won with a V12 engine, and it sounded glorious. So 1992, we designed the MP47. The previous year's car, the 6, was the last car with the manual shift. They had tried in '91 at Hungary with the semi-automatic paddle shift, which Tyler Alexander had been part of developing, but it was not mature enough to race. So that was its development continued with a view to being introduced in '92. So the '92 car, the MP47, was our first, as I mentioned before, first female moulded structure with more aerodynamic shape built into the structure of the monocoque. And it featured the first, for us, paddle shift with semi-automatic gearbox. It was quite a big car, it was quite heavy, and I think Ayrton extracted the most from it and had the famous win at Monaco with Mansell trying desperately, obviously never going to be able to pass, but it gave us some good races. But towards the end of that season, I remember being at our fax machine, good old fax machines, and this long fax was coming through from Honda. It was basically announcing their withdrawal from Formula One. It was pretty evident that this fax shouldn't have been for my eyes, so I gathered it all up, took it into Ron, whose face dropped a bit and said, "You haven't read any of this, have you?" And I said, "Read what, Ron?" And I kept that to myself. So obviously we were, after a long and successful partnership with Honda, we were going to be without them for '93. And of course by that stage, options were limited as to what we could do for an engine partner. Fortunately, even though Benetton were the factory Ford team at that time, Ron managed to do a deal and we became a customer Ford team. He didn't have Ayrton's name on a contract for '93 at that stage, so lots of things were up in the air as to what was going to happen. We embarked on designing the MP48. Henri Duran had joined us as head of aerodynamics from Ferrari, and we had come up with a very interesting and probably technically the most, well, I'm sure it was, most technically advanced McLaren that we'd made. And it had full active suspension. And unlike the Williams, which I think they had developed with Paddy Lowe, the active suspension for their car, which was sort of mainly sort of ride height control, the active suspension designed for the 8, which was done by Ian Wright and others in his R&D team, was a lot more technically advanced. So when Paddy did actually join us, I think he was quite surprised that McLaren had designed a much more technically advanced active ride system, which it controlled not only ride height but pitch and roll and also all the other controlling aspects of the car. Ron had managed to do this deal with Ford. We knew we were significantly underpowered compared with Renault with their V10 in the Williams, and also with the Ford works car engine in the Benetton. Ayrton was persuaded to at least try the car. We had Michael Andretti and Mika Hakkinen lined up as the race drivers that year, and Ayrton came over from Brazil after his customary winter break and drove the car at Silverstone, I think in March that year. Not only was pleasantly surprised, but actually he thought, actually this car could be a winner. And I think it was at that stage that he then entered negotiations with Ron. One thing that I always remember from that year, when we were designing the monocoque, the tyres were narrow that year, but I think the track had been a little bit reduced, and it was very important that for the aerodynamics that the air between the insides of the front wheels and the chassis gave the maximum opening effect for the downforce, for the washer of the front wing and how it went around the back. So the car was very tightly packaged, and of course we had all this extra stuff for the active suspension, including big looms for the wiring which had to run from the front to the back. And Henri had done a number of tests in the wind tunnel but couldn't make up his mind as to how long or where the side pod opening should be. I remember going to Henri and saying, Henri, at the moment your side pod is in a position, the one that you want, whereby the loom that runs from the front of the car to the back of the car is 30 millimeters. That is huge. It's 30 millimeters diameter, and it can only go here, and you've got 25 millimeters between the radiator and duct and the wetted surface, the aero surface. I said, you've got to give us more room. Oh, no, you can't have more room. I said, well, what are we going to do? He said, I'll tell you what, we'll compromise at 27 and a half. And I said, Henri, it doesn't work like that. It's 30 millimeters. So of course, what we ended up doing was putting a big dent, I think, in the top of the radiator duct, just so that the loom had somewhere to go. But he was adamant that he wasn't going to change his aero surface, and probably perfectly correct. But I thought it was quite funny that he was treating it as something we could barter with. So 94, of course, Ayrton had moved on to Williams. We had Mika and Martin Brundle join us, and Peugeot engines, and a kind of evolution of the 8, but the car engine combination wasn't a successful one. But of course the overriding memory of 94 is Imola, and even though Ayrton was with a different team, it still hit everybody very hard, as you can imagine. You know, Ayrton had been a McLaren driver for so many years. He'd won 3 World Championships with us, and you know, Ron especially was hit very hard. A tragic situation, and I suppose, you know, people say, well, how can the best driver in the world succumb? But of course, it's all accidents in Formula One are a combination of things which often are a sort of a freak combination of events which result in some terrible tragedy happening. And Imola was a case in point, with, you know, a bit of the suspension hitting Ayrton through the visor or the helmet. It was a reminder for all of us, actually, because I think, you know, that there had been fatal accidents as recently as '86 with Elio De Angelis in a testing accident. But as a design engineer, you kind of become a little bit immune to drivers getting hurt, because you're concentrating on the performance of the car and doing everything you can to make the car go as fast as it can. But equally, safety in Formula One could have been a lot better, and things that Max Mosley introduced after '94 and subsequently have greatly improved safety. We worked to the regulations as they were, and I was reminded of how serious a job we were doing. Funnily enough, at a Monza test, when I'd done some different steering arms for Steve, who wanted to play around with different Ackerman effects. And there's one that got through the system, and it actually broke and pitched Ayrton into the runoff cat litter at the first chicane, I think. And Steve phoned me up and said, "This is broken. It's not good. You know, it could have been a really bad accident." And it reminds you that actually it's not just making the car go fast, but you're responsible for these people, you know. And it's a terrible situation for any team that loses a driver. But everybody should be aware of the consequences of everything that they do. So the other thing it reminds you of is the huge respect for the mechanics, because, you know, as engineers, in very controlled situations, you can sit down, we can do the numbers on bits of paper, we can take our time to design the part. The mechanics, you've got to remember, every time they're at a race meeting, they're taking the car apart, they're putting it back together again, and literally the drivers' lives are in their hands, because, you know, if they do something at any time during the process of taking it apart, putting it back together again, then one mistake could cost the driver, you know, ultimately his life, or a serious accident, or injury. So hats off to them, because they deserve all the praise that they can get. As a kid watching in the 70s, like a lot of people, were traumatized with the loss of a driver, and you just sort of can't really comprehend these days how that affects people, because you know, every year or so, a driver who was a well-known face and somebody you felt you was a hero to you would succumb in an accident or something. And it's difficult for kids, a lot of kids these days, to appreciate the barbarity that existed in Formula One at that time. How they were allowed to do it, you know, or get away with it in many ways, and the contributions that people like Jackie Stewart have made to safety in Formula One has been immense. But on a personal level, being involved with the crash structures and the passing of crash tests, and just being part of the evolution of a much safer Formula One. It can never be 100% safe, of course, but that is something which I'm very proud of, and it's probably right up there, if not ahead of a lot of the success that we had. Is to be able to say that you're part of that is really good. The mid-90s was not a great time for McLaren, and collectively as a team, you know, we dropped the ball. Mercedes had come on board in 1995. For whatever reason, there were lots of lessons that had been missed with regards to now that active cars weren't allowed anymore, so we're back to conventional suspensions and things. But some of the design of the conventional suspension on the MP410, which was a horrendous looking car as well, not one to be proud of aesthetically or in terms of its performance, meant it had huge problems with pitch sensitivity and just mechanical suspension design. So that was not a great year for McLaren, and I think Ron and Martin Whitmarsh were looking for a new solution with regard to technical leadership. Steve had rejoined us actually as a consultant in '96 and ironed out quite a few of the problems, resulting in the '97 car, the MP4 12. And that car was actually a pretty good car, and it won in the hands of, got us back to winning again with Coulthard and Hakkinen. And Adrian was basically, I think, poached from Williams and joined us later that year with the view to taking over overall technical control. And even though he was technical director, it was, in effect, he was chief designer as well. And I think you can have different titles, but ultimately you need to have somebody who really understands the car dynamics, combination with the aerodynamics, and the integration of both. Because in the experience that I had over the years, we've had people join McLaren who were fantastic aerodynamicists, but they were probably more like aircraft aerodynamicists. They understood aerodynamics perfectly, but when you put an aeroplane or a racing car in close contact with the ground, it's operating in two mediums, and you really need to have a really good understanding of both for it to be a good car. And I think this is one reason why Steve was very good as a car designer, because Steve raced and still races actually cars himself competitively, and he has a fantastic understanding of the behavior of the car and what's it like as a driver to experience various aspects of the car's behavior when you're driving it competitively. And I think the reason he got on so well at McLaren was that he was given the opportunity to work very closely with the drivers, who very quickly identified something in common with him. He knew what he was talking about because he spoke the same language that they did. He, in a way, was more suited to being a good, if not great, car designer than Barnard, who was perhaps less of the car design. This sounds a bit, hard on JB, and I don't mean to be, but JB was a fantastic innovator, and Steve, I think, less of an innovator, but more had a great understanding of car dynamics and the integration of all the compromises you have to make between the mechanical setup of the car and the aerodynamics to keep the aerodynamic platform where you want it. And that's what really makes Steve very astute in terms of his ability to design cars. Engineering is such a vast spectrum of different types and different, there are different aspects of engineering and you can choose as your technical lead somebody who's particularly strong in a particular way, who brings something to the party and delivers on that. But ultimately you need somebody who has got a good overall generalist skills as well. And I think when Adrian joined us, it was evident that he was equipped with everything. He was somebody who I think started with Indy cars and March and understood the vehicle dynamics, having studied aerodynamics at Southampton, I think it was. And so he, as an aerodynamicist, got a good grounding in vehicle dynamics as well. Adrian is probably the greatest Formula One designer because he encompasses everything, all disciplines, especially when in an era where aerodynamics is so important. Not that it wasn't important in the 80s and 90s, but late 90s, 2000s, and right to the current day with ground effect cars again, aerodynamics is crucial to having a competitive car. And of course that's Adrian's, it's his number one subject, but he really understands how to get the best of the aerodynamics through being able to control that aerodynamic platform mechanically. So he has as much understanding as the suspension design, for example, as he does with the aerodynamics. And when he arrived at McLaren, we'd heard stories about the Williams, which was dominant in the mid-90s. And we'd heard stories about their lift-to-drag ratio being 3.2 or something, and our guys were saying, it's impossible, it's just a myth. You can't do better than 2.7 on lift-to-drag ratio. And of course, when we had somebody join us, this is before Adrian joined us from Williams, he was able to confirm that that's what they had, sort of 3.2, whatever it was. And it just brought it home to us that they were, or Adrian was, able to extract every amount of performance from the aerodynamics that he was able to, the tiniest of details and the tiniest of intricate sort of mouldings on the various bits of the car, which in themselves didn't add up to much at all, but put together made a significant difference. So he's absolutely focused on the attention to detail, to absolutely every tiny detail. So working for Adrian, he's a traditional drawing board guy, a fantastic draftsman, as well as all the other attributes I've mentioned. He would draw the car, I think, half scale on his big drawing board. He would draw the 3 views and then pass those on to people who would scan them and put them into the CAD system for turning into electronic versions of what he wanted. And in a way, I can remember admiring him at the time, because the rest of us, as sort of lesser mortal engineers, we would have to continuously reinvent ourselves as new technologies come along. Start with a drawing board, and then some CAD system comes along, and then a sort of parametric CAD system comes along. And you have to be learning all the time, learning new tools, new ways of doing it. But with Adrian, he got to a level where he understood his craft, and he could do it all on the drawing board, and he could just leave all of that to other people. He could just focus on what he needed to focus on. He didn't need to reinvent himself. And to this day, I think, he works on a drawing board, and it's one of his strengths, and one of the things which is what is so effective to why he is so good is his ability to not have to reinvent himself. He knows his craft, and he does it really well, and that's why he's great. So Adrian joined in late '97, and I was still project leader for the chassis monocoque and a lot of the composite bits and pieces. He pushed us in different directions. It was evident that he was quite happy himself working outside of his comfort zone, and he expected everybody else to work outside of their comfort zone as well. So he made us do things which we were perhaps not quite, comfortable with doing, but with the actual firm belief that we were doing the right thing and it would give him the result that he wanted. So one of the first things on the MP413 was Adrian wanted to change the cockpit and put an oil tank, a sort of a breather tank, underneath the driver's legs, which meant running, oil lanes from the back to inside the cockpit under the driver's legs. And this was like completely alien to us that we would consider doing that. But he was adamant that in terms of weight distribution and everything, it gave him something that she wanted to do. We'd already identified that with the regulation changes for '98, which were narrower cars, grooved tyres, that there was even more importance on a lower centre of gravity, something which Steve Nichols had actually pointed out to us when they did circuit simulations and things, and the massive lap time improvement, especially with narrow cars, that you get if you can just reduce the centre of gravity by even sort of 10 millimetres. So I think one of the things that Adrian was quite surprised at when he joined us was that traditionally McLaren had been very efficient with the structural design of the cars, such that they were regularly underweight and required ballast to bring them up to regulation weight. And we'd managed to get to a stage where in '98 we were something like 70 kilos under the weight limit, which was just, and Adrian was used to just about making the weight limit, I think. And we ended up requiring a huge machined dome of pieces of tungsten, which sat underneath the centre of gravity of the car, which was around about the middle of the floor of the fuel tank area. and we called it a dustbin lid because it was literally about this big in diameter, and it was domed, and you could tune it, and it just pushed up on the underside of the bag tank area so that the fuel capacity wasn't impacted too much. But that allowed us to have a super low centre of gravity for the whole car. Because if you can save weight anywhere on the car and you can put it into that tungsten bit, then the whole car centre of gravity drops, and it was, had a huge impact on the performance of the car in 98 with the MP413. So we had success with Adrian's designs in 98 and 99, won both championships in 98, and Mika won the Drivers' Championship in 99, of course. By 2000, Adrian was, I think, getting a bit frustrated because with Adrian, everything packaging-wise was just so small, in terms of crash structures, in terms of space that he gave you to put all the bits and pieces that needed to go in it. It was the volume available for putting stuff was becoming less and less. Although I was project leader for the monocoque design at that time, he wanted, I think, to have a change of direction in as much he wanted some new blood to come in, and Mike Coughlin was available, and he would be a good person to bring in as a fresh pair of eyes, coupled with the introduction of a chap called Jonathan Neal, who came in from aerospace. It wasn't great news from my point of view, and it completely upset the sort of the balance that we had within the team. Adrian was kind of a little bit oblivious to it because he was really at a level whereby he could design the concept of the car and leave it to others, but he wanted a fresher pair of eyes to look at some of the structural aspects of the car. And when Mike Coughlin arrived, he brought in a whole team of people that he had worked with, probably about 7 of them, I think, from Arrows, and that just completely changed the dynamic of the way the design office worked. Not that they weren't good people, I'm sure they were good people, but equally it was a major spanner in the works from our point of view, because these people hadn't grown up with the McLaren way. We talked about earlier on with Barnard and Ron. If you'd been around in those days, there are ways of doing things that you just are ingrained in you as to a right way of doing something and the wrong way of doing it. And it seemed to us that these people coming in, and they were not doing it the wrong way necessarily, and maybe it needed to be, changes needed to happen, but it was like they threw the baby out with the bathwater. My personal opinion is that it was detrimental to the team's performance, which set it on a downward course for a number of years following that, and after Adrian left, of course. Adrian admits that the MP418, which is a car that never raced, was a step too far, but I think it also gave Jonathan Neal the perfect excuse to sort of throw out lots of people he wanted replaced because he had a different way of working, and we'll let history decide as to whether he was right on that. It was disappointing, shall we say, in the way that lessons from previous years hadn't been learned, and more than anything, McLaren was a family of people who we knew what our jobs were. We didn't try to do everybody else's job, we just concentrated on our own job, and properly led, we came up with some great cars. And my overriding memory of working at McLaren is not so much the cars and the success that we had. They were special times, and I'm very privileged and thankful to Ron and John and Steve and Neil and everybody who helped me in my career. And ultimately, as much as the success means a lot, looking back, it's really the people, working with such great people that sticks in my memory, and some great friendships which started over 40 years ago and still going strong. And for my sins, I've formed McLaren, the Old Boys and Girls Association, which now has over 400 members from every era, going back to Bruce's time. And in fact, we had Wally Wilmot as one of our members. Wally was Bruce's first employee, and I've now subsequently been involved with a number of reunions, one of which is planned for later this year for the 60th anniversary. And it's really, those are the things to be proud of, I think. And it's such, at the time, yes, you're aware you're working for something which is a bit special, but it's not until you look back with a certain amount of time having passed that you think, that wasn't just special, it was really special. And I'm not sure how many people get the opportunity to sort of live their childhood dream, if you like, and experience what I got to experience in a golden age of Formula One. Yeah, they were fantastic times, fantastic people, and I'm just very privileged to have been part of it. In 2005, the pace of Formula One was really challenging, and with a young family and everything, I think it was time for a change. So I started out on my own as a consultant, initially working with companies involved with the Dassault suite of CATIA technologies, which I had helped introduce to McLaren because it was one of their sort of flagship companies, and it was interesting times for a while, just bringing some of the lessons that and methodologies that are involved in designing a Formula One car to other industries. Because the other thing about Formula One is it's a fantastic, perhaps unique industry whereby the creation of the product and the end user are basically all housed under one roof. And so the life cycle of a product goes not only from creation to end user, but also feeds back into the creation of the next one again. So it's the complete cycle, which is exactly what the inventors of this product life cycle management tools, if you like, is what they become to be known, encompasses. So for somebody like me to actually have experienced that and to bring those tool sets to practical use, from lust to dust, as they say, it was an ideal opportunity to take those to other industries, which I did for a while. And then another part of me, my kids said to me, Dad, you used to paint cars. This is when I was a teenager, and I had always, right from, I don't know, being 10 or 11, enjoyed recording the results of every race, drawing pictures of the cars, a lot of kids would have done at the time. And I used to love these profiles of aeroplanes originally. You'd get in books and there'd be different squadron markings and things. And I thought, I'd quite like to do that. And as a kid, I drew these side profiles of cars. And my own kids said to me about 10 years ago, why don't you try having a go at it again? And I thought, I wonder if I could. So I was slightly intrigued as to whether, A, I could still do it. Could I do it any better? One of the things that rubs off in you when you work for Ron and, working at McLaren is you kind of get fixated with attention to detail. Every detail matters. And this appealed to me in my artwork as well. So I now, over the last 10 years, sort of developed this sort of hobby, which is I'm very pleased people like to buy some of my prints as well. But I draw and paint these side profiles of cars, which many of McLaren's are meaningful to me, but also there are a number of other cars that either have meant something to me as, you know, growing up, witnessing them, or being something in my history. I get a lot of satisfaction out of painting these profiles, and it's a combination. People have said to me, it's interesting because you're an engineer, you can see that the engineering comes out in your art. So I think, you know, a technical illustrator who's not an engineer wouldn't necessarily pick up on or be concerned about some of the details that I'm obsessed with, if you like, much to, you know, the annoyance of my wife probably. But you know, I get totally fixated on getting something right, and because it's important to me, and I want it to be right. So I mentioned that, you know, I had engineering on my mother's side. I think I had artistic members of the family on my father's side. So maybe it's you know, I'm a combination of those two things. But it's interesting because I think being able to bring a hobby into something which other people appreciate is really good. And I'm very thankful to everybody who enjoys my my artwork.
And so there we have it, another fascinating insight into an incredible period of Formula One history from a rarely heard perspective. I want to say a huge thank you to Matthew for his time, and of course to you for watching. See you for the next one.